To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. If you're a Protestant and you spent more than 10 seconds on the internet looking at apologetic content from Catholics or Orthodox and you've read through the comment section, you've probably heard that quote from St. John Henry Newman that if you're deep in history, you will cease to be Protestant. But it's not often defined, what does it actually mean to be deep in history? And look, I've got all types of opinions on the quote itself, but today I want to talk about that very question. What does it mean to be deep in history? And I want to do so using the only universally accepted language of the internet, a meme, specifically the Iceberg meme. Now, if you're not familiar with the Iceberg meme, then you're probably a more virtuous person who spends less time on the internet, but it's basically this meme of like a typical iceberg, there's a little bit on the top that you can see, but there's so much more beneath the surface. And I think church history is a little bit like that too. A lot of people watch my videos or get interested in this stuff and they say, man, I want to learn about church history. And it's like, great. That's 2,000 years to comb through, so have fun. And look, church history is a lot. I love it. I help try to make it more understandable for people on this channel. So if you're new and that interests you, glad to have you here. Might consider subscribing like the cool kids. But in any case, there's a sense of the accessible church history, and then it gets deeper and deeper and deeper as you go. So we're going to explain that through the use of the Iceberg meme. Starting at the top, we've got the Book of Acts. Now, growing up as an evangelical, this is church history par excellence. This is the history of the church, right? I mean, if you want to know what the early church was like, you go to the Book of Acts. And speaking of the early church, I'll be focusing primarily on the early church because, again, 2,000 years, I couldn't get all of that into an iceberg. So we're just going to talk about the early church. But the Book of Acts, accessible to everyone, all Christians, they have it in their Bible, so pretty easy place to start. And you really should start there. Great stuff. You get to see what the early Christian movement looked like as it kind of goes out into the world from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, to use the kind of language of Luke in the Book of Acts. The second level, though, when we're really getting onto the iceberg proper here, would be reading the Apostolic Fathers. Now, you can read the whole collection in not that much time. I think it's roughly the size of the New Testament. I've gone through the Apostolic Fathers in my Patreon book club, which, by the way, if you join my Patreon, one of the perks you get is to join our bi-weekly book club where we read the Church Fathers together. We read the Apostolic Fathers together, and it was great. And so you can go through this in not too much time, and this allows you to start saying, oh, whoa, the church kept going after the close of the New Testament. And whoa, they're talking about things that seem a little different, like Ignatius, super into bishops. Or you've got the Shepherd of Hermas, and you're seeing people ask questions of, can you be forgiven for serious sins after baptism, which is a question that you might have never asked before. And you're realizing church history looks a little bit different. The next place you go, probably after the Apostolic Fathers, that's still pretty accessible to everyone, would be St. Augustine. No figure has had more influence, at least in the history of Western theology, than St. Augustine. And he has written so much that you could really spend the rest of your life just reading and studying his works. And if you only studied Augustine, if you went Book of Acts, Apostolic Fathers, Augustine, you're staying at the, above the waterline here, you would get a lot of historical theology out of this because so much of Western theology is kind of footnotes on Augustine, and Augustine is commenting on scripture and influenced by the Apostolic Fathers who went before him. So you're sitting pretty, and you at this point know a whole lot more about church history than a lot of people do. Hey, real quick, I just want to say this isn't the only iceberg though. There's also the iceberg of people who watch these videos. Maybe you're at the very top. Maybe this is the first video you've ever seen, in which case, hello, I'm Austin. This is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we bring simplicity out of theological and historical complexity to help people find beauty, truth, and goodness in the Christian tradition. So if you're in for that, welcome. So glad that you're here. In any case, I'm glad you're here. But you might be a step below. You might watch a lot of these videos, but you've never subscribed. In fact, over 50% of you who consistently watch my videos haven't subscribed. It's totally free. It makes me feel good, and I would love if you did that. It helps more people see these videos as well. It doesn't just boost my ego. So just one button, click, subscribe. That would be wonderful. But if you want to get to the bottom of this iceberg, there's a couple things that you can do. One, if you want to meet and talk about your questions, you can do that by booking a meeting with me. And I would love to kind of talk about the questions and concerns that you have. The link for that is in the description. But the bottom of the iceberg, the people that really make this channel possible are my patrons. So if you want to bore down all the way into this iceberg to reach the wonderful, wonderful depths, then consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. But then we could go one step further. And at this point, you're starting to kind of move towards deep in church history, I would say, but not fully, and I don't think in Newman's sense either. But the next step would probably be, I'm assuming you're kind of coming to this from probably a Protestant perspective, would be to start reading some of the Eastern Greek-speaking theologians. Now, maybe the first place you go there is St. Athanasius. He's very famous for kind of defending Nicene orthodoxy in that period between the Council of Nicaea, which he attended but wasn't a bishop yet at, and the Council of Constantinople, where the Creed of Nicaea is reaffirmed, which is just after his death. So Athanasius is a really great place to start if you want to go a bit deeper into kind of patristic theology on the Incarnation. Is probably his most famous work, and it's where I started my study of the Church Fathers. It has a preface by C.S. Lewis, which is worth the cost of the book alone if you get it in the Popular Patristics edition, which I would absolutely recommend. The next place you might go is St. John Chrysostom. Chrysostom is in some ways what to the east what Augustine is to the west, in that his writings are very voluminous. He has this huge kind of influence on the liturgy and the theology of the church. The name Chrysostom isn't like his birth name, but it's actually for golden mouth because he was such an incredible preacher. Often when I've done Bible study videos on this channel, I've referenced his homilies because he is someone who loves scripture and unpacks it and makes him very accessible to someone who's maybe coming from a Protestant background, because he's not very into speculative theology. It's very pastoral, it's very exegetical, and I think you would really enjoy reading him. One step lower than that, I would say, on this iceberg would be reading the Cappadocians, which is St. Basil, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, and St. Gregory of Nyssa. Here you're starting to get into theology that can at times be a bit more speculative, is incredibly deep, and is some of the best Trinitarian theology that we have. The Cappadocians are really kind of taking the baton from Athanasius and defending Nicene orthodoxy and expanding on Trinitarian theology at the Council of Constantinople with St. Gregory of, I believe was it Gregory of Nyssa or Nazianzus that was at that council? I should know that. I can't remember off the top of my head. But in any case, they are so much of the foundation of how we think about the Trinity. I mean, really, Trinitarian theology, we have Augustine's model. Before him, we've got Tertullian beginning to talk about it, which has a bit more of a monarchical sense to it. You got Augustine giving this like psychological model of the Trinity and De Trinitate, and then you've got the Cappadocians really expanding on the Trinity, sometimes in a way described as a bit more social Trinitarianism. That's a bit maybe simplistic, but emphasizing the persons within the Trinity. In any case, now you're getting into some kind of weighty theology, and it's really good, but you're moving down. And if you want to go one step further, now we're really getting into theological territory that begins to hurt your brain a little bit. And I would start there with Maximus the Confessor. He's a natural place to go after the Cappadocians and is in some ways like at the height of kind of the theology of the early church, but he's now kind of post Council of Chalcedon. So he's working with different categories here. And he's an incredible bridge between East and West, but he's also doing some really speculative, really interesting work that's definitely probably, influenced by some Neoplatonic thought and different things kind of going on there, that knowing the philosophical background is going to help. Fun little aside, that book club that I mentioned, our first book we ever read was Maximus the Confessor's on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ, which was an absolutely insane thing to do as a starting place. That was way too far down the iceberg, but it was fun. After that, you might go to someone like Dionysius, or Pseudo-Dionysius, as he's known to us. Now, this isn't necessarily chronological going through here, but Dionysius is going to be really drawing on some kind of Neoplatonic thought here and getting very kind of like difficult. He's going to emphasize apophatic theology, which means kind of theology by way of negation, by way of saying what God is not. You could read his work like on the divine names, or you could read his work, Mystical Theology, and now I don't know, maybe you're smarter than me, but it makes my brain hurt. You're starting to get pretty deep into the theological train here. And that might lead you outside of orthodoxy. Now, I'm not saying that Pseudo-Dionysius or Maximus are unorthodox, but I'm saying that their general theological trajectories might lead you to someone like Origen. Now, Origen is the first name on this list that is not a saint and has been, at least some of his theology, condemned by a council. Now, that might inspire you, which we'll get into a second, into asking new questions. But Origen is going to be getting even more adventurous with this thinking and going out on limbs that the church ultimately would reject. Things like apokatastasis, as far as the universal reconciliation of all people, the pre-existence of souls, things like that. Bear in mind, almost everything about Origen is hotly debated. We don't have as good access to his works as scholars would like, in part because he was condemned and we lost a lot of his writings because of that. And that is going to lead you to ask really interesting questions about the nature of church history, including, if you find really good things in Origen, you might say, have other heretics been misunderstood? Which could lead you to reading Nestorius or Dioscorus and looking into their lives. So Nestorius is going to be the one who's famous for what we consider now the Nestorian heresy, which was addressed at the Council of Ephesus, I believe it was, in 431. There, one of the questions is going to be, is Mary the mother of God? Which is to say that, is Jesus fully human and fully divine, in a way that we could say that Mary is the mother of God in kind of like a syllogistic sense. Jesus is God, Mary is the mother of Jesus, Mary is the mother of God. So those are some of the questions that are going to arise, and you'll find if you start getting into the secondary literature, whoa, this is complicated. Was Nestorius a Nestorian as we understand it? And you'll have the same question with Origen. Was Origen an Origenist in the way that we understand it? And Dioscorus is going to be the kind of heretic, if you will. I'm using air quotes there. I want to have respect for my Oriental Orthodox brothers and sisters, that is remembered as such, at least in the West and in the East, the Eastern Orthodox, that is, as kind of a heretic at the Council of Chalcedon, that he was pushing back on the Chalcedonian definition there of Jesus existing in two natures. It's a very fine nuance that he was going for there, preferred from two natures rather than in. And there was all of these kind of debates about how the human and divine natures of Jesus kind of coincided in his person. Dioscorus, as well as the Oriental Orthodox, are in agreement that Jesus is fully God and fully man, but the theological language that we use and how we understand persons and natures got really in depth there, along with other disputes and how they received prior councils, which takes you back to Ephesus and all of these questions. And you're thinking, whoa, have we gotten the councils right? Have we understood these heretics? Have we gotten things wrong? Maybe the people I thought were heretics aren't actually heretics. Welcome to near the bottom of the iceberg. Things get really complicated as you go through this, and you realize that church history is a lot messier than maybe you thought. And that could take you down another layer. And I would put some of the Gnostics in this category, because if you thought, okay, Council of Ephesus was right, Council of Chalcedon was right, but now after you looked into it more, you're thinking, I don't know, it's more complex than I thought. Maybe you go to that next group that you always thought was definitely wrong, the Gnostics, and you think, for all of the talk about Gnosticism that Christians do, I never hear them actually talk about actual Gnostics. And you think, maybe I should read the Gnostics. So you're reading Valentinus and Basilides, and you're thinking, whoa, this is very different. We're talking about emanations and archons, and this is getting way over my head, and it's really complex. And you're thinking, maybe, just maybe, everything I thought I knew, maybe I didn't. Maybe I have to go back from the ground up. And that then could lead to a different layer that I want to get at. So I want to pause here to say that all the way through this, we've kind of moved from just figures who are more or less known to you. It is primarily an intellectual history, and I would call this historical theology rather than history proper. It's interesting to distinguish between these disciplines, because historical theology is primarily going to be a history of ideas, in the way that you tell the story of historical theology is big ideas and the proponents of those ideas, as well as kind of the people who fought against them. But we think of history in that way as a movement of theological propositions, of theological schools of thinking and all of that. And that's a completely fine way of telling history. But there's other ways of telling history. You could talk about how the church on the ground functioned at these times, which could often be very different than how these great thinkers kind of thought about the church in an idealistic sense of like what theology should be. But we could talk about what theology was. What did the average person hold to? Talk about how the church organized itself, which might be different than how people thought the church should be organized. In other words, we could move from an intellectual history to a bit more of a concrete history. And that would get us into something like the acts of the ecumenical councils, where we're seeing not what they thought should be done, but what was done. And this is a layer of history that I think a lot of people don't get to. And interestingly, for this meme, we're now kind of below the iceberg itself. This is no longer an intellectual history. This is a nitty gritty reading letters, reading like the minutes of councils, getting into the schisms of the early church, as well as a layer below that I have as well, the material history. I think this is a really interesting thing that comes out when we talk about icons. We could have this debate over what was the theology of visual representation, and we can do that by looking at our primary sources that we're used to reading, our theologians. But we could ask different questions when we start to do archaeological and material work, where we say, but what was actually happening in the churches? What was happening in the catacombs? What was happening in the synagogues? What type of visual representation do we see? And that's a whole different way of evaluating evidence. One of the questions that often doesn't get asked in these questions of church history and who's right is, what evidence is in view? How do we rank it? And like, what counts? Because so often it's just, okay, the people that we've already determined as saints, what they've written counts. But then as we've gone down this, we've said, but maybe we should listen to the testimony of people who have been considered heretics, which way widens the viewpoint of it. And then we could say, well, what if we didn't just listen to the big figures, but what if we tried to get to the ground and see what was actually happening? And that, again, is going to be a whole different way of doing history, require different skills, different interpretive abilities, and rely on very different sources of evidence. And this is quite the iceberg to then go down, because there's a whole nother field to look into there. But the last layer I want to look at, and where this can sometimes go for people, is what's very fashionable to talk about now, which is this idea of early Christianities, plural. You'll notice one of the very things that's in vogue in the historical world is to talk about things that we thought were kind of more or less cohesive movements as not singular but plural. So we talk about Christianities, Judaisms, things like that. We talk, instead of assuming that this was always a unified thing, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or any number of things, scholars like to then say, actually, it seems like we can see distinct streams. And so you'll get to read someone like Paul Fredrickson, who's arguing that, in the early years of Christianity, the early centuries really, that you have disparate theological movements that would only be united in time to kind of form, or not united necessarily, but would only in time form a singular stream called orthodoxy, whereas on the outside you have these other movements. I'm not endorsing or not endorsing this viewpoint right now. I'm just saying that that's the type of reading that you begin to get into. And I think the final layer for a lot of people who look into this stuff is then getting into historical Jesus studies. I'm assuming throughout this that someone's been a committed Christian, is interested in this for questions of, how should I worship? How should I live my life? All of these things. And it's animated by a love for Christ. And I've seen some people go through this iceberg. They get to the bottom, and indeed below it at this point. And then they begin to question, what can we know about Jesus at all? Because depending on the kind of empirical approach that you've taken to this, depending on how you count evidence, what counts, and kind of what weight you're giving it, you might begin to ask, should I even trust the Gospels as historical? What can I know about Jesus? And this can all lead to a place of, I don't know, a lot of skepticism. And now we're just kind of floating or sinking through the dark water beneath the iceberg. It's a rather dark place to end. I don't think it has to go that way, of course. I think we could take this in a lot of different ways, but this has been an interesting opportunity for me to think through, what does it mean to be deep in history? Newman doesn't exactly tell us in the context of his work, but I think a lot of us have this idea of I want to be deep in history. I want to know these things. And I make this video not to discourage people from that, but to point out that depending on what we mean by that, that's a lofty goal. If being deep in history requires going through all of this and a whole lot more, because remember, this is only the early church. We could do this for the medieval church too. We could talk about, going from Aquinas then into Palamas and the Palamite councils. We could talk about the Council of Constance. What do we do with having 3 popes there? And what do we do with the Council of Florence and the reception of that? It could get really interesting. We could do the same thing with the Reformation, right? We could talk about the mainstream reformers, but then we could talk about kind of the reforms that were taking part in different places and how we think of proto-Protestant groups. Again, we could do a lot of stuff. So if we want to say that you have to do all of that to be deep in history, I think we all have to throw our hands up and be like, okay, well, I'm not deep in history. I'm probably not even deep in one of these categories. But I do think this shouldn't necessarily just be a sense of okay, none of us know anything. I think it's also just an opportunity to think of what does it look like to keep learning and to keep asking questions and to maybe question some of our assumptions, but also have in mind, like, where do I want this to lead me? I'm not trying to create a sense of a slippery slope. I'm not saying that everyone who goes deep in history is going to end up questioning the historicity of Jesus. I think there's good reasons to believe the things that we do about Jesus. But I think it is helpful for us as we're kind of drilling down further and further to ask, where am I trying to get to? Like, what are the questions I actually want to answer? I know that this can create a lot of anxiety for people. And so just as a small plug, I want to say that these are the questions that are floating around in my head and have driven me to write a book on ecclesial anxiety, which will hopefully be out for patrons soon. It's been an absolutely really theologically and just psychologically, emotionally stimulating experience of trying to think about why it is that people get so anxious over these questions. And I hope that it'll be a great resource for you. So be on the lookout for more about that. But in any case, for today, that is the iceberg of early church history. I'd love to know what you think and where you would put these things. What do you disagree about and where do you think things should be?